It was 1945, the final months of World War II. The Allies were pushing forward and Germany was collapsing from within. But in the skies above, the war was far from over. The air still burned with bullets and fear. High above enemy territory, a B-17 flying fortress, one of America's proudest bombers, thundered through the heavens. Its engines roared against the wind, its metal skin shivering under the cold breath of the stratosphere. Inside that aircraft sat 10 young men, barely out of their teenage years, each one carrying the weight of survival, duty, and death. Among them was a gunner named Sergeant Harold Hal Simmons. He was only 19, with a face too young for war and eyes already aged by what they had seen. Hal manned the tail gun, the last line of defense, the eyes in the back of the plane. For hours, he had been scanning the skies for German fighters, his hands gripping the twin .50 caliber machine guns that stood between his crew and destruction. Every mission felt like his last. Every flight was a gamble against death. The morning was quiet, eerily quiet. Below them, the German countryside rolled by. Shattered cities, blackened forests, and rivers choked with the wreckage of war. The radio crackled, breaking the silence. Enemy activity reported near Sector 4, eyes open. Hal adjusted his headset, scanning the horizon. For a moment he saw nothing but clouds and light. Then, a flash, a glint of silver slicing through the air at an impossible speed. "What the hell is that?" someone shouted. And then they saw it. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter in human history. Sleek, deadly, and impossibly fast, it looked like something from the future, a weapon the world wasn't ready for. Allied pilots had whispered about it for months. They called it Hitler's secret bird. Some said it was invincible. It could climb faster than any plane, strike before you even saw it coming, and vanish into the clouds. And now, it was coming straight for them. The crew went silent. Fear filled the cabin. The pilot shouted commands, the bombardier checked his guns, but no one really knew what to do. The jet closed in like lightning. The roar of its engines was deafening, a sound unlike anything they had heard before. The B-17 was slow, heavy, a flying fortress. But against this new enemy, it felt like a dinosaur facing a dragon. Hal's heart pounded. He could feel every beat in his chest. His breath fogged the glass as he tracked the jet through his gun sight. He knew he couldn't match its speed. He knew he couldn't even aim properly. But still, he tried. The Me-262 fired first. A burst of cannon shells tore through the sky, shredding the tail of a nearby bomber. Flames erupted. Men screamed over the radio. The jet banked sharply, ready to make another pass. And now, it was coming straight for Hal's position. "Here it comes!" he yelled. He lined up the guns, his hands steady now. Fear turned to focus. The jet grew larger in his sight, faster than thought, faster than fear. Hal didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just pulled the trigger. A single burst of .50 caliber rounds blazed into the sky, golden streaks of fire cutting across the frozen air. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, an explosion. The jet's wing caught fire. The impossible had just happened. The German jet, the pride of Nazi engineering, was falling from the sky. The radio went silent again. No one spoke. The pilot turned around. The gunner stared in disbelief. One shot, one burst. One 19-year-old kid had just done what no one believed possible. That day, in the endless gray of war, a boy from Kansas, or maybe Ohio, or New York, it didn't matter, had taken down the most advanced killing machine ever built. It was a story that would echo through generations, a reminder that no matter how powerful machines become, human courage, instinct, and luck will always have their place in history. That was the day one B-17 gunner made history, the day a single burst of fire rewrote the rules of air combat forever. The skies over Europe in 1945 were a living battlefield. Thunderous engines, smoke trails, and bursts of fire carving through the clouds. Every mission meant gambling with death. Inside one of those bombers, a B-17 flying fortress, sat a young tail gunner named Sergeant Harry Tex Thompson. He was barely 20 years old, but war had already aged him. His world was the narrow, freezing metal bubble at the back of the plane, his eyes locked on the guns, his hands always trembling slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The bomber crews knew the danger that came with every flight. The German Luftwaffe had introduced something terrifying. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was fast, deadly, and untouchable. The Me-262 could slice through bomber formations before the gunners even had time to aim. Allied pilots called it the Silver Ghost. On that cold morning, Tex's crew was flying deep into enemy territory. The air was clear, the formation tight, and the bomb bay loaded. Everything seemed normal, until a flash of silver streaked through the sky. At first, Tex thought it was sunlight glinting off another bomber's wing. Then he realized it was moving too fast. It wasn't a bomber, it was a jet. The Me-262 roared in from above, cannons blazing, tearing through the air like a thunderbolt. The B-17 shook violently. Alarms screamed. The intercom crackled with panic. "Jet! Jet incoming!" someone yelled. Tex swung his guns around trying to track the impossible, a target faster than anything he'd ever seen. The sky became chaos, tracers, smoke, and fear. And then, he made the shot. Tex gripped the twin .50 caliber machine guns tighter, his heart pounding so loud he could feel it in his fingertips. The jet flashed past like lightning, vanishing before he could even pull the trigger. The radio was alive with shouting, pilots calling out positions, gunners screaming about damaged planes, and someone yelling that 2 bombers had already gone down. The Me-262 came around again, its sleek metal body slicing through the clouds with terrifying grace. It wasn't like the old German fighters. No propellers, no warning sound, just a sudden streak of death. Tex's commander yelled, "Hold your fire till he's close." But close meant suicide. The jet could shred them in seconds. Still, Tex waited. He watched the sky, tracking the faint shimmer of the jet's exhaust. He knew it would come for them again. It always did. Bombers were slow, heavy, easy prey. Then, through the smoke, he saw it. A glint, a movement, a blur heading straight for their tail. The Me-262 was diving fast, guns blazing, firing from almost point-blank range. Tex's training took over. He swung his turret, lined up the guns, and squeezed the trigger. The B-17 rattled as streams of red-hot tracers tore through the sky. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the impossible did. One burst, one lucky burst, hit the jet dead on. The Me-262 exploded in a blinding flash, debris scattering across the sky. The radio went silent. Tex just stared, frozen, unable to believe what he'd done. The crew cheered, screaming into their mics, but Tex said nothing. He just kept watching the burning wreck fall through the clouds. It was over in seconds, but that moment would make history. The explosion faded, leaving only smoke trails twisting through the cold sky. Inside the B-17, no one spoke for a moment. It was as if time had stopped. The only sound was the drone of the engines and the faint crackle of the radio. Tex slowly took his hands off the trigger, his gloves shaking. He could still smell the gunpowder, feel the vibration of the guns in his arms. "Did that really just happen?" someone whispered through the intercom. The pilot, still stunned, muttered, "He got it. He actually got the jet." The crew began to cheer again, their voices breaking through the fear that had gripped them all morning. But Tex didn't celebrate. He looked out through the turret glass, his eyes scanning the horizon for more jets. He knew the Luftwaffe wouldn't take this lightly. Somewhere out there, another Me-262 pilot had just watched one of his own vanish in flames, and he'd be coming for revenge. Down below, the bombers continued their deadly march across the sky, heading deeper into enemy lines. The sunlight glinted off their silver wings, each one a flying fortress carrying tons of bombs and the lives of 10 men. They had a job to do, and there was no turning back now. Tex leaned back in his turret, wiped the frost off the glass, and whispered to himself, Let's finish this. What he didn't know was that his single burst of fire would soon become one of the most talked about stories of the war. A story so unbelievable that even military historians would doubt it. But the gun camera film and eyewitness reports would later prove it true. One young gunner, with one perfect burst, had taken down a machine the world thought was unbeatable. When Tex's B-17 finally returned to base hours later, the crew was exhausted, their clothes soaked in sweat, their nerves shattered. But the story of what happened in the sky had already begun to spread like wildfire. Ground crews rushed toward the bomber as it taxied in, their eyes wide as they saw bullet holes, scorch marks, and the shattered glass of the rear turret. Tex climbed out slowly, his face pale but calm. A young mechanic ran up and asked, "Is it true? You shot down a jet?" Tex didn't answer right away. He just nodded once quietly. Within minutes, the entire airfield was buzzing. Pilots and officers gathered around the crew, wanting to hear every detail. Most didn't believe it. A B-17 taking down a Me-262? Impossible, one captain scoffed. But when the gun camera footage was developed, the room fell silent. The film showed everything. The jet diving in, Tex's tracer fire streaking upward, and then the explosion. It was real. Completely real. For weeks, the story traveled across the Allied air bases in whispers and disbelief. The brass called it a miracle shot. Newspapers back home got hints of the story, though military censors blocked most details. Still, everyone wanted to know the name of the gunner who'd done the impossible. Tex, however, didn't crave fame. He'd lost too many friends in the skies to celebrate a single victory. In his mind, that shot wasn't luck. It was survival. Each day, new missions were assigned, new targets marked on maps, and new dangers awaited. But that one moment in the air had changed everything. It proved that courage, timing, and maybe fate itself could still turn the tide, even when facing a machine built to end hope. What Tex didn't realize was that his single burst of fire had not only destroyed a jet, it had shattered Germany's growing myth of invincibility. The Allies now knew the enemy's jets could bleed. And that knowledge alone was enough to light a spark of hope in the hearts of every bomber crew flying into enemy skies. Days after the mission, Tex's unit was summoned for a full debrief. Intelligence officers, mechanics, and commanders crowded into a smoky operations room filled with maps, film reels, and the smell of burnt coffee. The projector flickered to life, and the gun camera footage played again, slow motion, frame by frame. The Me-262 appeared on screen, sleek and deadly, diving straight at the bomber. Then came Tex's burst, a single perfect stream of bullets slicing through the jet's fuselage. The officers leaned in, whispering in disbelief as the German jet burst into flames and broke apart mid-air. "He got him," one of them muttered. He really did. The room went silent as the projector light faded. The commanding officer turned toward Tex and said, "Sergeant, what you did up there defied every law of chance. You saved your crew, and you made history." But Tex, standing in his oil-stained uniform, didn't smile. He simply nodded and said quietly, "Just did my job, sir." He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man trying to survive one more mission. Outside the briefing room, the winter wind howled through the base. Planes lined up on the runway for the next raid, engines rumbling, propellers slicing the cold air. For the men of the 8th Air Force, there was no time to rest, no time to celebrate. The war went on, and each flight was a gamble with death. Still, something had changed. Morale. The word spread across bomber groups and fighter squadrons. A B-17 had taken down a German jet. It gave every gunner, every pilot, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the impossible could be done. Back in Germany, the Luftwaffe's high command was shaken. Reports confirmed the loss of one of their prized Me-262s, shot down not by a fighter, but by a lumbering bomber. To them, it was a humiliation. The Me-262 was supposed to be invincible, the weapon that could turn the war around. And now it had fallen to a kid with a steady hand and a burst of courage. As weeks passed, more Allied bombers began encountering the feared Me-262s. But something was different now. Tex's story had become legend across air bases in England and France. Pilots who once trembled at the sight of the German jets now took to the skies with a renewed sense of determination. If one man could take down a jet, others could too. Crews began studying Tex's gun camera footage, analyzing every movement, every second. They learned how he had waited for the perfect angle, how he held his fire until the enemy was too close to dodge. His discipline, his patience, became part of their training. Soon, the results began to show. The Luftwaffe's once unstoppable jets started falling from the sky. Not in great numbers, but enough to make a difference. The Allies adapted quickly, coordinating fighter escorts, adjusting flight formations, and reinforcing tail gunners with better sights and ammunition. The B-17s, once seen as slow and vulnerable, were fighting back harder than ever. And though Tex's single burst had been just one lucky moment, it had taught a powerful lesson. Technology alone couldn't win a war. Courage and instinct still mattered most. Tex's name began appearing in secret Air Force briefings, often followed by the words, "exceptional conduct under fire." His story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the age of new, terrifying machines, the heart of a soldier could still turn the tide. But behind every victory, there was a shadow, the reality that war had no heroes who came home unchanged. For every Me-262 that fell, another bomber went down in flames. Tex knew that better than anyone. He had looked into the face of death and survived, but every time he took off again, he wondered if this flight would be his last. Tex sat alone one night in the dim light of the barracks, a tin cup of cold coffee in his hands, staring at the floor. Outside, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the fog, another mission preparing for takeoff. The others were laughing, playing cards, pretending the war wasn't still raging in their minds. But Tex couldn't laugh anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the jet exploding again, the bright flash, the pieces falling, the pilot's helpless silhouette spinning into the clouds. He knew that man was dead because of his single pull of the trigger. And though the world called it a victory, for Tex it felt different, heavy, haunting. He had read somewhere that the Me-262 pilots were often young too, barely older than him. Some were barely trained, desperate to protect their skies. The thought gnawed at him. What if that pilot had been just like me, scared, doing his duty, trying to survive one more day? War didn't care about faces, names, or reasons. It turned men into targets and courage into instinct. As the weeks went on, Tex became quieter. He still flew, still fought, still did his job perfectly. But the spark that once drove him began to fade. Commanders called him a hero. Newspapers wanted his story, but when they asked for interviews, he refused every time. "There's nothing heroic about war," he said softly. "You just do what you have to do, and hope you make it home." Yet deep inside, he carried something no metal could erase. The truth that courage wasn't about glory. It was about fear, duty, and the unbearable cost of staying alive when others didn't. And that, more than his impossible shot, was what truly defined Tex. The boy who shot down a jet but never stopped hearing the sound of it falling. Months later, the sound of gunfire over Europe began to fade. Cities that once burned under night raids grew silent. The war that had consumed millions of lives was finally coming to an end. On a quiet spring morning in 1945, Tex's unit received the news they had barely dared to hope for. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The base erupted in cheers, hats flying into the air, men hugging each other with tears streaming down their faces. But amidst the celebration, Tex stood apart, watching the sunrise over the runway where so many of his friends had once taken off and never returned. The victory felt distant, almost hollow. He had survived, but at a cost no one could see. In the days that followed, bombers were grounded, missions canceled, and soldiers began packing for home. Tex wandered through the now quiet airfield, touching the bullet-riddled fuselages that had once roared to life with the thunder of war. He stopped beside his own B-17, scarred, patched, but still standing. He placed a hand on its cold metal skin and whispered, "We made it." When he finally boarded the ship back to America, the air was filled with music and laughter. Men were dreaming of home, of families, of peace. But Tex sat alone by the rail, staring at the endless ocean. The wind was calm, the sea blue, but inside him there was still a storm. He knew he was leaving the war behind, yet part of it would always travel with him, in the memories, in the ghosts of the skies, and in that one flash of fire when he pulled the trigger. The world would call it victory. For Tex, it was survival. And survival had never felt heavier. When Tex finally stepped off the transport ship onto American soil, the crowd erupted in cheers. Bands played, flags waved, and reporters crowded the docks to capture the returning heroes. But to Tex, the noise felt distant, unreal, like echoes from another life. Families reunited all around him, soldiers laughing, crying, hugging their loved ones. Tex had no family waiting that day. His parents had passed away before the war, and his younger sister lived across the country. He just stood there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of the sea, feeling the solid ground beneath his boots. For the first time in years, there were no sirens, no gunfire, no orders barking through the radio, only peace, a strange, heavy kind of peace. The military wanted to honor him. They sent letters, invited him to ceremonies, even offered medals for his extraordinary act of valor. But Tex quietly refused most of them. He didn't want to be remembered for killing someone, even an enemy. He wanted to remember the men he'd served with, the ones who didn't come home. He visited their graves when he could, placing his worn flight badge on one of the markers before walking away in silence. Life after war was harder than he ever imagined. The nights were long, the dreams worse. Sometimes he'd wake up sweating, hearing the roar of engines and the hiss of the Me-262 streaking through the clouds. He found work at a small airfield, fixing planes. It was the only thing he knew. But even then, when he looked up at the sky, he didn't see beauty anymore. He saw memories, smoke trails, fire, and the faces of men who would never grow old. Tex had survived the war, but the war had never really left him. It lived quietly inside him, in the silence between breaths. Years passed and the world moved on. The war faded into history books, its heroes replaced by new faces, new conflicts, and new headlines. The story of the B-17 gunner who shot down a jet became one of those half-remembered legends whispered among veterans, mentioned briefly in old military reports but soon lost in time. Tex never corrected anyone, never sought credit. He lived a quiet life in a small town, fixing engines by day and sitting on his porch at night, watching the sunset fade into the same skies he once fought beneath. Sometimes neighbors would ask about his time in the war. He'd smile faintly and say, "I flew with good men." That was all. He never spoke about the jet, or the mission, or the moment that changed history. The medals he did accept stayed locked in a wooden box in his attic, gathering dust. To most people, he was just another mechanic, another face in the crowd. But deep down, he carried the memories like invisible scars. Every year on Veterans Day, Tex would visit the Airfield Museum, standing quietly before the massive silver wings of a restored B-17. He'd rest his hand on its cold metal and whisper, "We did our best." Sometimes a tear would slide down his cheek and he'd quickly wipe it away before anyone could see. He wasn't a man chasing glory. He was a man who had seen the price of it, and chose peace instead. History may have forgotten his name, but for those who truly understood war, Tex's story lived on, not as a tale of triumph, but as a reminder that even in the darkest battles, humanity still flickered like a small, steady flame. Decades later, long after Tex had grown old and gray, a historian researching the air battles of World War II stumbled upon a forgotten gun camera reel buried in an Air Force archive. The film, covered in dust and labeled Unknown Mission, 1945, showed a sequence that stunned everyone who saw it. A B-17 tail gunner firing a short burst and a German Me-262 jet erupting into flames. The historian traced the footage, piecing together reports and mission logs until one name resurfaced: Sergeant Harry Tex Thompson. Newspapers picked up the story, documentaries mentioned his name, and aviation experts called it one of the most remarkable aerial kills in history. After nearly 50 years, Tex's impossible shot was finally recognized for what it was: not just luck, but precision, bravery, and an instinct only born from chaos. By then, Tex lived quietly in a small house on the edge of town. When reporters arrived at his door, he welcomed them kindly but humbly shrugged off the attention. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he said softly. "I was just trying to stay alive, same as everyone else." But as the story spread, something beautiful happened. Veterans began writing letters to him, thanking him not for shooting down a jet, but for reminding them that courage often comes from fear, not pride. The Air Force invited him to a memorial ceremony, where they unveiled a restored B-17 in his honor, its tail marked with the same insignia Tex once flew under. For the first time, he smiled fully, not out of pride, but out of peace. When Tex passed away a few years later, his funeral was small but dignified. The flag folded over his coffin carried the weight of his quiet legacy. Pilots and historians alike remembered him not just as a gunner, but as a symbol of endurance, a young man who faced an unstoppable machine and proved that heart could still triumph over metal. In the end, the legend of Tex wasn't about war or death. It was about what it meant to hold your ground when the world was falling apart, about doing the impossible when no one believed you could. His story remains etched in the skies of history, whispered among airmen even today. The tale of the B-17 gunner who, with one calm breath and one perfect burst, reminded the world that courage still lives in the hearts of ordinary men.